My name is Jonathan Outridge, and my father was Dr. Leslie MacDonald Outridge, a long-time general practitioner in Gympie who saw war service in World War II. So my father was born in 1900, born in Brisbane, but the family was from Redland Bay, where his father had retired after being a captain of a pearling lugger up Cape York. He retired to do a bit of farming down there by the waters. The family had a little ketch with a kerosene engine, and they used to pot around the islands of Moreton Bay, across to Stradbroke, down to Southport. I guess they did a lot of fishing and did some, boys' own adventure type growing up experiences, which was probably a good thing to do. Dad would have grown up, of course, during World War I, and as a teenage boy would have been strongly affected by the events of that time. Sometime in the 1930s, decided to use his medical skills in a military setting, and joined the 5th Light Horse Regiment, which I think was based at Maryborough, I believe, and he was their regimental medical officer from about 1932 onwards. When World War II started, Dad would have been 39 years of age. He would have had a lot of medical experience, particularly experience in surgery, anaesthetics under his belt, and was unmarried, had no kids, and I guess he felt that it was his duty to enlist, and he did almost straight away. So in 1940, Dad was seconded into the AIF, initially with the 11th Field Ambulance and subsequently with the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance as a major. Now that unit was formed in New South Wales, but in March 41 was transferred to the Northern Territory, where they set up near Winnelly Airfield and were part of the northern defences of Australia against the threat of Japanese invasion. And during that time, Dad would have been, subject to the same, intense bombing and strafing attacks that the Japanese inflicted on the airfield and other military units in that part of the world. So there's a story that there was a set of ambulances lined up under mango trees adjacent to their camp, and my father had spotted a Japanese aircraft come over one day and wondered if it was a spotting aircraft. So he then ordered the ambulances to be dispersed, and the next day Japanese Zeros came and strafed along that line of mango trees. So he was right, it probably was a spotting plane, and he probably saved a few vehicles from being destroyed. We don't really have much information about his service, but I think that those attacks were very intense. The attack on Winnelly Airfield was particularly intense, and I think Darwin was really bombed very intensely, including all the shipping in the harbour. So I presume that there were casualties that he saw and treated, but we don't really have any more information about that time. In 1942, Dad was appointed as the commanding officer of that same unit, the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance. In 1943, that unit transferred back to a place near Wollongong, where they prepared to ship to the Papua New Guinea theatre of war. So in May 1943, 212 members of that unit went to Sydney and embarked upon the hospital ship Centaur in Darling Harbour. Now the ship was painted white with large red crosses. It was illuminated by spotlights it was always thought that the Japanese would respect the immunity of hospital vessels. However, that wasn't the case. So on the 14th of May 1943, the hospital ship Centaur was torpedoed off the coast of Queensland near Cape Morton at 4:10 in the morning, a time determined by a wristwatch that one of the members of the crew was wearing, which stopped at that time. Now, I've read in various books, and there are stories in the family about his experiences at that time. Because he was the commanding officer of the field ambulance, he was given an officer's cabin on the bridge of the ship, as opposed to the rest of the unit, which was all, accommodated downstairs in the ship. And that's probably the reason he survived. The story goes that when the torpedo struck, Dad was asleep. He woke up and found the wall of his cabin was on fire, including his life preserver. And very quickly the ship went down. It sank in 3 minutes, so there was almost no time. He apparently attempted to awaken men in other bunks nearby, but they couldn't be roused. They may well have already been dead or unconscious from the concussion. And then water rushed up a passageway, and he was entrapped in an air pocket underwater, struck his head. Tried to swim out, was tangled up in ropes and buckets, swam out again after freeing himself and managed to get it to find a stairwell, got on deck, and the ship then just went down underneath him. After that, a life raft popped up, and then a first aid kit popped up. So he climbed on board, and he and the other survivors, those clinging to life rafts, life preservers or wreckage, drifted in the waters off Cape Morton for 36 hours. And they were subsequently spotted by a search aircraft and were picked up by a US destroyer, the USS Mugford, rescued them, and he was subsequently taken to Greenslopes Hospital in Brisbane. One of the mementos from that time was a red life buoy light. It's a little red metal canister with a light that would flash as the buoy rocked in the water, which Dad obviously salvaged and was in the family for some decades, and was then donated by my mum to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. So you can see that there if you want. Within a month, Dad was seeking to return to active service, and just a month and 2 days later was appointed as the commanding officer of the 2nd 8th Field Ambulance. So the 2nd 12th had been going to Milne Bay to support the Australians who had successfully turned the Japanese back there. But by the time my father made it to the PNG theatre, the war had shifted north around the coast of PNG. So he took part in landings near Lae at a place called Scarlet Beach in September 1943. So it was an amphibious assault across open beaches against heavy Japanese opposition. Dad's medical ambulance unit was early ashore, under fire. The story was that they had to shift location to a place that had better cover against machine gun fire, rifle fire, and attack by the Japanese. Some of the medical equipment didn't make it on shore in time, so he didn't have everything he needed to treat the injured. On the first day, that field ambulance unit received and treated 53 seriously injured military personnel. And I think if you think about it, the largest hospital in Australia would have trouble dealing with 53 seriously injured people all turning up in a 24-hour period, let alone a little field ambulance on a beach under canvas, but I guess they did what they could. There are some newspaper stories from that time that talk about an operating theatre being dug into the ground, a canvas roof over the top, sandbags around the edge, a little gap for air, and the surgeons standing 5 feet underground to try to reduce the chance of them being, killed or injured by enemy fire. Every canvas tent in the hospital apparently had bullet holes or shrapnel holes in it. By 1946, Dad was demobilised and returned to life in Gympie and civilian practice, although he must have been deeply affected by his war service and the events that he took part in. Certainly the family said that he was never quite the same man ever again. He would never apply for his war medals. My mum subsequently did, and I think he was quite bitter about those who were rewarded and those who weren't. So I think that's probably not an uncommon experience for people who've been in military conflict, from what I understand. 1956, my father met my mother. So Dad was returned from the war, an old warrior, an old doctor by that stage, who'd never married. But my mum was a midwife working at Gympie Hospital, where Dad did a lot of obstetric work, and they formed a friendship, formed a relationship, and subsequently married. And I'm the third of three sons, the youngest of three sons, Peter, David and myself, Jonathan, all born in the next 6 years. I think I've got that right. And Dad continued to work as he had for many years, just as hard as anyone could work, I think. So he used to get up in the morning and go to the local hospital, see all his private patients in hospital, and then he would do a morning clinic in the surgery at the house on Caledonian Hill, and then he'd have an afternoon surgery, and then he'd have an evening surgery, and he would do that 6 days a week, and on Sunday he'd have a light day and just do morning surgery and afternoon surgery. So it truly was a 7-day-a-week job. I remember wandering in and out of the surgery, which was attached to the house there, just above the council chambers in Gympie, when Dad was free, and occasionally seeing him at work, but he was a busy man, a busy doctor at that stage. Unfortunately, at the age of 67, he suffered a large stroke, which robbed him of his speech and paralysed him down one side of his body. And at that point, obviously, the practice had to close and he had to retire from work. The house was sold. We moved to Brisbane, where my mother's family was, so her mum and dad and her brothers and sisters, so that she had their support. And we moved into a house at Cooinda, where we lived. Now, even though my father had a big stroke and could barely walk, I remember him crawling all over the lawn outside the house, pulling out ribbon grass with a screwdriver until it was all gone. There's no more ribbon grass there. He did that okay. At the age of 72, he died after a further stroke at a young age, and I think his death brought on partly by the stresses of the conflict that he'd been in. So when you think about it, he took part in 2 opposed amphibious assaults, one at the Huon Peninsula near Lae and one in Indonesia at Borneo, against enemy opposition, and it also survived a catastrophic torpedoing and shipwreck, one of only a handful of survivors out of the ship's crew, the ship's company. So he had probably been through a lot, as many people did, but I think that he'd certainly experienced a lot during World War II. So I think my father's early life, growing up during World War I and living a rough and tumble life by the edge of the sea down Redland Bay with all his brothers, fishing and doing a bit of shooting and doing some sailing. I think that probably, you know, would have been a great way to grow up, I think, and I think it probably made him partly the man he was. I think he certainly had a strong sense of duty by the way he enlisted and the way he used to work. I think that duty was a strong part of his character, that sense of duty. And I'm glad that he finally did marry and had kids, and otherwise I wouldn't be here. But unfortunately, you know, I was only 6 when he had his stroke, and so I never really got to know him as a man, something that I regret. I wish I'd known him better.